On April 9, 1942, the largest army ever to surrender under American command laid down its weapons on a narrow peninsula in the Philippines. 9,000 Americans, 66,000 Filipinos, 4 months of fighting on starvation rations, sometimes 500 calories a day had come to this. A white flag over Bataan, and the beginning of something the men could not yet name. They would give it a name later. The ones who survived would. Among the men who formed into ragged columns that morning on the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula, at a staging area called Mariveles, at the edge of the South China Sea, 2 of them had grown up on the same block in the same small Ohio town. Call them, as history calls so many men like them, by what they were to each other rather than by the names now lost to us. One was a captain, the other was a sergeant. They had enlisted together in 1941, shipped out together on a transport that passed under the Golden Gate Bridge in November of that year, and had spent 4 months in the same rifle company, fighting the same losing rearguard action through the jungle of Luzon. When the order came on April 9th to lay down their rifles and assemble in the road, they stood a few feet apart in the same column and said nothing to each other. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said. To understand what they were walking into, you have to understand what they had already survived. The American and Filipino forces on Bataan had been fighting since January, 99 days of rearguard action against a Japanese force that outnumbered them and outgunned them, and critically, received resupply when they did not. MacArthur had been evacuated to Australia in March by direct presidential order. The men left behind knew what that meant. They fought anyway, on rations that had been cut to half, and then to a third of what a soldier needed to stay effective in tropical heat. They ate whatever the jungle offered. Monkeys, iguanas, the horses and mules of the cavalry they could no longer use. By April, a third of them were sick with malaria or dysentery or both. Major General King, who commanded the forces on Bataan in those final weeks, later said that he knew there was no military solution. He surrendered to prevent a massacre. He was not sure he had. What happened to men like the captain and the sergeant on the road north from Mariveles is among the most documented atrocities of the Pacific War. Historians have measured it in miles, in temperatures, in numbers of dead. Survivors have measured it in things they cannot describe in precise units but cannot stop seeing. The march was 65 miles, from the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula north to the rail station at San Fernando. The temperature on those roads in April climbed above 100 degrees by mid-morning. The Japanese military had anticipated perhaps 25,000 prisoners. They received 3 times that number, and they were neither prepared nor willing to provide adequate food, water, or medical care for the columns they forced north. The prisoners marched in groups of roughly 100 men under armed guard on dusty roads through sugarcane fields and mango groves that offered a view of shade they were not permitted to enter. Artesian wells lined the route. Men who broke toward them were shot or bayoneted. A man who stumbled and went down was beaten back upright. A man who could not be beaten back upright was left to die where he fell or dispatched on the roadside. No one was permitted to assist him. The captain and the sergeant marched together in the same column, as close as the guards would allow. Survivors of that search described the road in ways that strain the machinery of language. There were men, by the end of the first day, walking barefoot because guards had stripped their boots for the leather. There were men drinking from muddy carabao wallows, water thick with animal waste and disease, because the thirst had become more powerful than the knowledge of what that water would do to them inside a day. The dysentery that followed killed men who had survived the march itself. The sun killed men who had survived the dysentery. Camp O'Donnell, at the end, killed men who had survived both. The sergeant had been carrying a leg wound since the last weeks of fighting on the peninsula. A shrapnel fragment, cleaned in the field, never properly attended. By the second day of the march, the wound had begun to turn in the heat. By the third day, his leg had swollen inside his trousers, the skin pulled tight and burning. He kept walking. The captain walked at his side, watching him, not speaking. They had learned in 4 months of war that speaking about a thing sometimes made it real in a way that silence did not. On the third afternoon, somewhere on the road north of Lubao, the sergeant went down, not slowly, not with a stumble or a warning. 1 step, and the road was coming up at him. The captain caught him under the arms before he hit the ground. Around them, the column kept moving. Because stopping was not an option, the column was allowed. guards shouted. The captain pulled his friend upright. The sergeant's feet found the road again, but there was nothing in them anymore. No spring, no purchase, just 2 feet that the ground kept stealing back. The captain put the man's arm across his shoulders. He shifted his own weight forward to compensate. He began to walk north again. Scenes like this one were documented by survivors of the Bataan Death March and by the photographs preserved in the National Archives. American prisoners using improvised litters, shirts stretched between rifles, any apparatus they could assemble from what had not been stripped from them, to carry men too broken to walk. Some of those who carried knew they were spending energy they could not replace, consuming calories they could not make back, burning reserves that the next week of March and the months of captivity after might need. They did it anyway. The arithmetic of loyalty does not work the way other arithmetic does. These men were not strangers. They were, in many cases, what the sergeant and the captain were to each other. The person who knew you before any of this, the person whose presence in the column beside you was the only continuity left between who you had been and who you now had to be. The captain was not a large man. The sergeant was larger than he was. That is simply what the effort cost. He bent to the weight and kept moving. The guards had opinions about men who assisted other men. Some treated it as a waste of 2 lives' worth of strength and separated the pairs. Some watched and said nothing. The captain kept his eyes on the road ahead, kept his friend's arm across his shoulders, and did not look at the guards long enough to invite a decision. 65 miles. 2 more days. The rail station at San Fernando was not a relief. The boxcars loaded there were designed for 40 men. 100 were put into each car. The doors were sealed. The heat inside was a different kind of heat from the heat on the road. The road at least had movement, had air, had the partial fiction that the destination was survivable. In the sealed boxcars, in temperatures well above what the human body is designed to endure without water, men died standing up, held in place by the press of other men's bodies, unable to fall. The captain braced the sergeant against the wall of the car and kept him there with his own weight for the duration of the journey. When the doors opened at Capas and the columns formed again for the final miles to Camp O'Donnell, both men were still standing. Camp O'Donnell was supposed to be the end of the march. It was not the end of the dying. The camp had been built as a Philippine Army training facility, designed to hold 10,000 soldiers. 60,000 survivors arrived. There was 1 water spigot for the American prisoners. 1, and the line for it stretched without end, so that a man might wait hours for a canteen of water that was barely adequate, and by morning be sick with thirst again. There were no sufficient latrines. There was no medicine. 400 men were dying at Camp O'Donnell every day at the peak of the dying. By the summer of 1942, more than 1,500 Americans and more than 26,000 Filipinos had died inside that camp. Not from combat, not from the enemy's weapons, but from disease and deliberate deprivation, dysentery, malaria, cholera, beriberi, starvation, the slow arithmetic of what happens when 22,000 men who have spent 4 months fighting on 500 calories a day are denied, systematically, the basic requirements for staying alive. The captain and the sergeant survived Camp O'Donnell. They were among a smaller number of American prisoners moved to Cabanatuan in the summer of 1942, where conditions were somewhat less lethal, where a small number of Red Cross packages eventually reached some of the men. A tin of Spam, a bar of chocolate, the shocking sensation of a flavor that existed before the war did. In the years of captivity that followed, across the Philippines and, for some men, in forced labor camps in Japan or Manchuria, the balance of who kept whom alive shifted constantly. There were months when the captain was the delirious one, burning with malaria, and the sergeant sat through the nights beside him. There were months when both of them were only enduring, not dying, which passed for good fortune. They endured it together. The way you endure something with the person known you since you were 8 years old is not the same as the way you endure it alone. The difference is not a matter of sentiment. It is a matter of surviving. Of the roughly 22,000 Americans captured on the Bataan Peninsula in April 1942, more than 7,000 never returned to the United States, a death rate above 30%. By comparison, Allied prisoners held in German captivity during World War II died at a rate of roughly 3%. The Pacific War exacted a cost from its prisoners that the European theater almost never asked, and Bataan asked the highest cost of all. The names of the dead were carved into a list that kept growing through 1942 and 1943 and 1944. Families waited. Telegrams arrived or did not arrive. The machinery of American government was at war, and the machinery of grief had to wait its turn. The war ended in September 1945. The prisoner columns were liberated and processed and put on ships. The captain came home to Ohio in November of that year. The sergeant came home a few weeks later on a different ship, and the captain met him at the bus station and drove him to the street where both of them had grown up, and the two of them sat on the porch of one of their childhood homes for a long time without talking, watching the October light on the street, because there are some things for which there is no adequate language and some silences that are not empty. The United States government did not begin returning the war dead to American soil until October 1947, 2 years after Japan's surrender. On October 10th of that year, the Army transport ship Honda Knot docked in Oakland, California, carrying 3,027 caskets from the Pacific. The first official repatriation under the American Graves Registration Services, Return of the Dead program. A military band played taps on the pier. More than 171,000 families would eventually choose to bring their men home under a program that lasted until 1951. It was the largest repatriation of war dead in history. For many of the men who survived Bataan and Camp O'Donnell, the bodies of friends, lost on that march or inside those camps, were among the caskets that came home in 1947 and 1948 and 1949. For the families who had waited, sometimes 6 or 7 years from the last letter to the casket on the caisson, the return was not a resolution. It was a different kind of grief from the waiting, more legible but not smaller. The captain attended one such burial in the summer of 1949. A man from their company, who had gone down on the march in the first 2 days, before either of them could reach him, whose family had waited for years for any answer, and had received one that could be held in a box and lowered into Ohio earth. The captain stood at the graveside. The sergeant stood beside him. There was nothing to say that was adequate to the occasion, so they said very little. Some stories from the Second World War are about what a man does in a single moment. One charge up a ridge, one act of valor that history then freezes and decorates. Those stories are real and they deserve to be told. But there is another kind of story, less easily honored, that the Pacific War produced in great numbers. The story of what a man keeps doing, over 5 days on a road in killing heat, and then 3 years in a cage, and then the long ordinary decades after, carrying the weight of what he survived alongside the weight of who he carried, because the two are inseparable, and he would not have it otherwise. Of the 22,000 Americans who surrendered at Bataan on April 9, 1942, more than 7,000 never came home. The ones who did never entirely left.